All right, guys, welcome to today's lecture. We are looking at volume, mass, and texture. Volume and mass kind of go together, and then texture is kind of a separate fundamental, and these are still kind of fundamentals that we're working our way through. So, like I said, definitely volume and mass, it's hard to talk about one and not the other. And then texture is just the continuation of those fundamentals that we're going to look at. So let's start here. I have this one on the PowerPoint too, but I wanted to kind of show some aspects of it before we really get into the definition of volume, and then specifically look at how volume is shown in art. So in the textbook, it shows these two figures, and this one they show to represent volume, and this one they're using to show mass. But the thing is, even with mass, right, everything has volume, and mass is going to have volume as well. So just because this is an example of what we would consider something appearing as mass and having mass, it doesn't mean it doesn't have volume as well. So you could almost argue, you could say volume and mass. And how this gets into it is really what the definition of volume is. So let's put that here. We'll do volume. And what volume is, and it's in the simplest form, is it's just it is the amount of space occupied by an object, right? So every object that is a form, so by an object, therefore forms have volume. And we're going to talk more about mass in just a minute, but every form then is going to have a volume. That also then shows you here, which goes to this next image, is that volume is a shape in 3 dimensions. Oh, I ran out of space. Let me put it down here. So a volume is a space in 3-dimensional form, right? That's the form part again. So what you have here is the shape, and the shape doesn't have volume because it's 2-dimensional. Now it can have implied volume. So when you have drawings or paintings, right, those are 2-dimensional. But whatever is being created, that artwork can then have implied volume. Just like this shape can have implied volume, but it doesn't have actual volume. You need a form which then has the actual volume, right? And usually you just say volume and you don't put the actual in front of it. But if we're talking about implied versus actual, it's good to separate the two. So that's kind of the key. If you're looking at artwork and you're looking at something that's 2-dimensional, it definitely can have implied volume. And then what we're going to look at mostly are the forms, because we're still under that kind of idea of forms with volume and mass, and texture. Texture is part, and that's where this goes together with the volume and mass, is all of those fall under forms, those 3-dimensional artwork and objects. But anything can have an implied volume as well, and often does, to give a sense of what that space is occupying, or what that object is occupying in space, right? That helps with the visual context of the size of something overall, right? And that's part of it, is that volume gives a sense of size, as mass gives a sense of weight. Although we're going to look at that more in terms of here. So we'll put sense of size, right? And mass gives a sense of weight. Now, mass and weight are not technically the same thing in mathematical and scientific terms, but we're not going to get too far into that because that gets into the math and science of that. We're looking more at art and how it tends to be perceived of mass then as a sense of weight in that, and volume as a sense of size. And what it basically said, how much it's occupying in space. So that's volume. Now, I want just to be clear with that, there's this video we're going to take a look at. It's really short, but it does a good job of showing how you would find volume. And we're obviously not finding volume in art, but by showing how you would figure out the volume of something, one in mathematical terms, and then two by using it within water displacement, it gives you a sense of what volume is. Because if you tend to look at it in just the geometric shapes, it's like, oh, well, it's just the space that you fill up into here, and however much it fills up, that's the volume, and it is, but it doesn't have to be just geometric shapes, right? Everything has volume. That is a form, that is an actual form, that's three-dimensional versus two-dimensional, which has the implied volume. So let's take a look at this. It's, like I said, just a minute 50, and then we will talk about it.
Volume is the measurement of the amount of space an object takes up. In a fish tank, we can find out what takes up more space, the rock or the filter. We need to measure the volume of both objects. To find the volume of the filter, we use the formula. Volume equals length times width times height. Using a ruler, we take measurements. The measured value for length is 5 centimeters. The width is 5 centimeters, and the height is 5 centimeters. Our calculated volume is 125 cubic centimeters. The shape of a rock is described as an irregular solid because it is not made up of simple shapes. As a result, we need to find the volume of the rock in a different way. To find the volume of an irregular solid, fill up a beaker with a known amount of water. Then drop the rock in. Notice that the water level is higher. The movement of water is known as displacement. The amount that the water moved is 25 milliliters and is also the volume of the rock. Everything that takes up space in the fish tank has a measurable volume. If you were to enter the tank, think about how much water would be displaced. That's your volume.
All right, so as I said, short, but hopefully the idea is that it gives you a little bit of a sense of how you'd find volume, but also just what volume is. So a volume in art, if we're looking at, what is important about this, well, we're going to look at open volume in just a minute and how that plays a huge role in perception. But it definitely gives you this sense of, and we can put perception and perspective of the artwork. When you understand, and not that you're calculating out the volume each time, but when you understand and have a general sense of the volume of an artwork, it creates, because it's amount of space occupied by an object, it gives you this ability to place it within the context of the area that it's in. So, when you have something that's incredibly massive and takes up a lot of volume, you're going to view that artwork differently than something that has a small amount of volume. And artists can use volume to not only manipulate, we'll put manipulate, oops, or establish a sense of awe or feeling of being large or feeling of being small, right? So it can manipulate or establish a sense of your size or the artworks within the world. So that's the idea. If you come across something that had smaller volume, then it's going to give you this sense of that's minuscule, or so that's so tiny in a larger world, or something is massive and you're looking at it from at the bottom and you're looking up and you have this sense of perspective that it's just this massive thing that is much larger or giant in the normal volume of things. So if you play with the volume, right, if you take something in an object and it's larger than it normally would be for what we are familiar with in a size and stuff, and that how much an object takes place, like let's say a pencil, and you have a pencil and you have what you have an expectation of that size and that volume of how much a pencil takes up in space. And then you made it super tiny, right? That's going to give you a different perspective on that pencil than if the pencil is then made giant and takes up a whole lot more volume. And we naturally just think of that, right? This isn't something you have to calculate and measure, because we naturally place that within the context of the world and how we see it. But that's how artists can use it to adjust our perspectives or manipulate it in certain ways in our feelings of that. And we'll look at that more with scale as well, because that's part of playing with scale. Okay, so that's volume. So now open volume is when an artist encloses a space with materials, right, whatever that they're making the art with, but is not completely solid. And this, what this does is that open volume can give the sense of an artwork being light, even if it's not. So when you open something up, then what it can do with open volume is it make it appear that it's airy or that it's moving. It also not all open volume does this, it can create a sense of movement. And we'll look at some examples here. So movement or right motion. And again, that doesn't have to, but that is one of the things that it does. Now, the other part of open volume that tends to come into play with this is called negative space. Well, we looked at positive and negative shapes, and you have negative space in open volume. And that aspect of it is simply just the openings between the form. So if you have any type of form, and we'll look again at an example in just a minute, then that's the negative space, and it creates the open volume. And this also can give a sense of motion, or even a type of object or place. So some can give a sense of that it looks like water, or it can give a sense of, because then that's connected to the motion, but it's specific to the idea of water, or it can give a sense of a spiral movement. And so that you can play with those negative spaces where there isn't any form, and that can create it. You can also create implied shape with the negative space, or the positive, depending on what they're doing. So implied shape, and it just leaves ultimately the work visually open. You have a different sense of art when you can see through it than when it's a solid object, right? And so this creates a different perspective. Oops, having trouble with the writing today. So different perspective when you can see through it versus solid objects. Okay. It also, when you have an open space and where you can see through, this can be, then they use light as an active part of it, or light and dark contrast. So you'll often, with light and dark contrast, you'll have the materials be darker and then the open spaces be lighter. If it's just light playing off of it as the main goal, the idea is, right, light shining through it and hitting the object so that it filters through the object itself. Versus if it's solid, right, then the light isn't going to filter through in any way and change, how you see it or the colors or the reflection or shade. There's so many different things that light does, which we'll be looking at later with the scale and stuff that way, or with value, sorry. And so you can use light to create basically a secondary aspect of that art, along with, if you choose to do light and dark contrast, you can also play around with that as well. And so this then you have like multiple dimensions essentially of open volume in its most basic sense, where it's just not a solid object, to specifically how you use the negative space. And not all open volume plays with negative space. It's more meant for the aesthetic of it, but there are plenty that we're going to see that do. So let's take a look at those now. So I've kind of been describing it, but it's easier to see if you look at some examples. This one I already put up, right? You got the volume and mass. Here you have the volume, but also could be open volume. This one is definitely that traditional kind of geometric shape. Two different geometric forms. Well, one's a form, one's a shape, right? So you have the cube with the form, and then you have the circle as the shape. And then this part in the middle, right, is the open volume. But it's easy to see with the volume in the sense of, if you filled up this cube with water, then that's how much volume this cube had, right? If this was solid and you didn't have the circles there, then just pouring water directly in would give you that volume. Nonetheless, it still has that same exact volume, whether there is the circle or not, because it's how much the space that this object occupies, right? This also gives you a sense of, we talked about, right, it being lighter. This is metal, and yet because it's not solid, you get this sense of it weighing less than a solid object. You can also have light being played through, because this is so open. Actually, what you see here, right, the light changes based on the time of day. And so by placing it outside, the artist is very intentionally choosing to use that as part of their sculpture, right? So think about the workbook, the Gateways to Art workbook journal, where it's asking you to find a three-dimensional object, and it's asking about, did they, think about the location and where they placed it, and did that have a purpose? Well, in this case, yes, this one did, right? Because how you're going to perceive this artwork is going to be different when it's light versus when it's dark. And having a more airy, open sense during the day, but some of that open volume is going to disappear in appearance at night. All right, another example of open volume. This is it's titled Ghostwriter, and it's made up of these suspended pieces of it's metal. These what look like lines, right? That's metal, and then all of these little objects here. There are a variety of things. They're small little head figurines. It also has objects, random objects, and letters, metal, and they're all kind of metal pieces. And then what it creates is implied shape. And what's the implied shape, right? If you look from afar, right here, the implied shape is we could say face or head, right? But when you get closer, then that implied shape disappears. So how is it open volume? Well, the volume again is just the amount of space an object it occupies. So here, it's basically this. I kind of cut it off, but the lines do go all the way. So this is the volume of what it occupies. But it's open volume because it's not solid, and you have all these spaces in between all of these lines and spaces in between all these little pieces. That makes it not a solid object, right? So how does this work as far as you're thinking about playing with the sense of, and this one doesn't have motion as much, although it has some actual motion, because if the wires move at all, you get a actual movement in it. But what you do have is playing with the whether you're looking close up or whether you're looking far away, and that you see the implied shape that only is created because of open volume. It also then makes it look like it's lighter than if this was this tall and this big and it was a solid mass. And all of that is then meant to create a certain kind of atmosphere in how you're perceiving the art, and just even whether you're looking at it close versus whether you're looking at it further away. This is another one of open volume, right? It's open. It also has that negative space. And so here we clearly see this one definitely has that, let me put it up here, that sense of motion, as it looks like it's exploding. Here's the center, and it's all this stuff is exploding out, almost like one of those like deconstructed items where they have the object and then the computer graphic deconstructs it into its individual pieces, right? So it kind of looks like that. Here's the center of where it was all a single mass, right? Just regular volume. And then it exploded into open volume. So you get that sense of movement because of the open volume. But you then also get right here, right? That's the volume of that art. Okay, let's go to mass now. So the next one we're going to look at, which again goes with volume very much in how you observe and use and look at art. There we go. Has to do with mass. Now, mass is, it suggests something, the artwork, right, is solid, and it occupies space. It also is directly connected to this idea of weight. Now, technically, mass, in terms of, again, science and math, is not weight. Mass is essentially the what we are made up of, right? So that if you look at, for example, yourself or a table or whatever, it's the molecules or atoms that you are made up of. But what we connect it to is we tend to see mass as giving us mass gives us a sense of the weight. Essentially, we look at an object, and all objects, all substances have mass. One of the things that can be different between the two is that you can have objects that are all the same volume, but different mass, right? And likewise, you can have, we'll say, or same mass, different volume. So example of that, man, the pen is not wanting to work well today. Okay, so an example of that would be if we had, let's say, 3 beakers, and they were all filled with the same volume. So we'll pretend that this is exactly the same volume in all 3 beakers. And in one of the beakers you had air. And then in the next one you had, let's say, lead. And then in the last one you had water. Okay, so if these were exactly set up, right, they would all have the same volume. But each is a different mass. Right, because, and then this is why then we connect it to weight, because it gives us a sense of weight. With air versus lead versus water, they're all going to be different weights as well, because mass is connected to weight. It's just not, it doesn't have to be, right? And it isn't exactly the same thing. So for example, you can have, it's a suggestion of mass. It can imply mass. Art, and well, in anything, objects can imply mass without it actually being there. And this term is implied mass. And artists can use this to give you, when you're looking at something, so where you might, it might be implied mass that it's super heavy, but it's actually light. And so how you perceive that artwork is going to be different when you think it's heavy versus when it's actually light. Or they might perceive something as very light, which they can use open volume to help portray, but it's actually really heavy. And so you see how volume and mass, just they go together in that structure. The other thing important with mass is just that our perception of mass is important. And what this means is that it's based on how we perceive something as larger, as heavier, or the type of object or size, right? We immediately have, let's say, a view on its mass and often its volume. So I'm going to put that one too. This already preconceived notion of what something should be of its mass and volume. For example, a pencil again. If you show a pencil I'm going to look at that and only having a preconceived idea of what the volume of that pencil is because I've used pencils before. But I'm also going to have a preconceived idea of the mass of that pencil because I've held pencils before. Right, so our experience with objects provides that expectation, let's say. And this is then where the artist can play with implied mass, right, with this expectation. Artists take that and can mess around with it because we already have a sense of, oh, this pencil is supposed to be this. So let's say I see a pencil and it's, it's something an artist has done. And it's something that you can interact with. It's a form, not a two-dimensional one. And it's something that you're allowed to pick up. And so you go, oh, look, this is, some art design. It's a pencil. Let me pick it up so I can play with it. And I pick it up, and it weighs only as much as a feather, right? Well, my perception of what a feather and the volume and mass of a feather already is coming from interacting with the feather. But now I've been almost subverted by this because there was an implied mass of the pencil because of how they created it, and yet it was not that actual mass. And it might be the right volume, where it's the actual volume of a pencil, but the mass was implied. And I'll show you an example of this in just a second. And then you could also do it where it's the opposite, where it's the actual volume of a pencil, so you look at it and you perceive it. Because you can't play with mass if the volume is off. If the volume is, at least in this scenario, right? If I have a pencil, in my head, I already have an idea of the mass of that pencil. And if the volume looks correct in my head, then I'm going to immediately think and expect the mass to be the same. We have, because of our experiences, right, we have an expectation of the volume and mass the artwork will be, the object, will be. And so then that's how the artist can subvert our expectations. And you can do that through, again, I'll put the example down from that. So if we'll put here the pencil, and let's say, so I have the pencil here. Right, and so my amazing pencil there. So there's my pencil, right? And then I say, okay, this pencil, appears to be the correct volume. And you're not, again, usually analyzing that. It's just naturally what you think. Then I'm going to assume, based on the correct, what I believe to be the correct volume, that I'm going to assumed based on the correct volume, that the mass is a set amount. But if the mass is off, so we'll say if mass is not the expected amount, the meaning of the artwork changes. Or the meaning of the object, depending, right? And so you can play with this to manipulate and change the expectation from what our expectation of that is. So let's look at an example of the mass. Here is one, This was titled House. And what this artist did, Rachel Whiterid, did is that this was an actual house, and she filled it with concrete. And then tore down the the outside of the house, right? The wood and the materials from that. And then what was left was just the concrete. This, by just looking at it, looks heavy. And so it's going to give a perceived sense of a lot of mass. And this is not implied or subversive. This is the mass lines up with it, right? So that you have this sense, it's not actual mass, it is actual mass, but it's not a subversive mass. This mass gives a sense of strong, sturdy, heavy, right? Large mass tends to give those feelings. Strong, sturdy, heavy. And that's what it actually means. You can't pick it up because it's too big, right? That's what it is. And that was the intent. So here you have using mass for its purpose. Not playing with the size of the mass, not messing with the mass. This is the mass, that's what the intended idea of the mass is supposed to be. Here's another one, the Olmec heads. This is from the Olmec culture. They did these massive colossal head sculptures, and we'll actually look at this when we look at the Olmecs. And these things are huge. And you have, right, that the mass, then we know it's solid. It is actual mass. And so it gives a sense of this massive, heavy, and steady object, which is what their intent was, because we believe, we don't know entirely, but we believe that these were to show kings, and potentially kings that had died, and it was meant to give a sense of power and authority of their past kings, if not somewhat connected to being deities as well. And so you get that sense of this kind of strong, powerful figure, right, because of the mass. So that's how you can use the mass just as is. Then you have implied mass. Here we have rocks, right? Rocks, the assumption, we'll say here the expectation, right? The expectation of rocks, mass of rocks, right? Of mass of rocks is that it's heavy, right? You think of mountains or boulders, they're heavy, they're large if they're boulders, right? When these are more boulders than rocks. However, the material that these are made out of is foam, which is light. So you actually have an implied sense that's meant to trick into creating, and also this implied mass is meant to try to suggest that it's nature. Right? So that's another aspect of implied mass. It's not just, let's put that on there with this. Actually, we'll finish this and then I'll add that to it and stuff. Oh, it's gonna, here, discard on that. I'll put it on since it made me get rid of it. That one of the other things that you can do with implied mass, we'll put in a C, is that implied mass provides an expectation of material, right? So in this case with the rocks, but it is not. So that you have, put it here, the example, implied rocks, gives a sense of not only heavy, but also nature. But in reality, it's not. It's a man-made material. It's foam, and it's light. And so these are very contrasting with the expectation versus the actual. And that is where it's so, I think that's important, right? Is that it's not just about weight or what we perceive the weight to be, but the materials that are used in the process as well. This is another example. This is used in Hollywood all the time, right? Here we go, right? Implied mass looks like a massive heavy boulder rock, and he's picking it up because it's made out of foam. Hollywood uses this all the time because obviously, like, if you want a superhero who throws a rock, they're not actually picking up a real heavy boulder. They're picking up one of foam. When people are fighting in a scene and they smash into the, let's say the bathroom, into a sink, and it breaks, that's not made out of porcelain. It's a lighter material that breaks easy and isn't going to hurt the actor or the stunt double, but gives the implied perception of that mass in the process. And so it's a kind of a trick of the mind in using implied structure. Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at is texture. And texture, you can also have implied or actual or implied texture as well. Texture in terms of definition, right? Any three-dimensional object can be touched. It's tactile sense. Come on, pen. So any three-dimensional object has texture. It's that tactile component. And the tactile is connected to the sense or sensation, let's say, that we experience with those materials. Now, you can already have a preconceived idea because it's something you've touched before and it looks like something you've touched before. Or if you've never seen that type of material before, then you might be comparing it to something that you've had before. But texture has that tactile part, that's that physical component of touch. That's important, right? And you may not be able to touch it, but, and so whether you can, actually touch it versus just, looking at it because of past experience, right? I've touched carpet before. And so when I look at carpet, you assume the texture and how it feels. In fact, it actually your brain goes into this sense of memory, and while you aren't actually feeling it, you get a sense of feeling it because of that, which is pretty cool. You can also then have, so the texture, actual texture, right, is any form three-dimensional object is going to have actual texture. And if it's just the actual texture, then if something's like we're going to see is made out of wood, it's made out of wood and it feels like wood. And then you have, so we'll put the actual texture here and then we'll do implied. So actual texture, the goal is it appears and is the material. So that example, wood and feels like wood. that's what actual texture is, right? There's no trickery behind it. There's no switch up in that process. Then you have implied texture. And implied texture tends to be with two-dimensional art, right? And that's going to be drawings, painting, photos. So photography, right? You could be taking a picture of a three-dimensional object that has actual texture, but the photo itself is only coming across in two-dimensional. You can't actually, when you touch the photo, it's not actually giving you the texture. And that's the idea by it. If you touch it, so if you touch it, we'll say if you touch the artwork, it is not the implied texture you feel, but the material it was made on. Right, so an implied texture can be really good to the point of that it looks like you really want to reach out and touch it because it just looks like it's that texture. And you know, textures vary in form, both implied and actual. And of course, the type of texture used is going to play the same role of that sense of experience and expectation. So if something was slick or cold or rough, you can have soft, you can have hard, you can have it be, you know, whatever else in that sense of slick, cold, rough, hot, prickly, any of those sensations, right? And these are all things that we know because of experience in, you know, that tactile aspect of touching objects. And then, so when we see art, especially if it's implied, or what we'll see with the other being subversive, we have an expectation of how it's going to feel. And even if you can't touch the artwork, the thing that is important with touch is that we rely on those impressions that we receive from our hands and the experiences that we had. So, right, how does texture influence how we interpret art? Right? Well, we create associations. So if you see something that looks like a slick metal that you might associate with smooth and cold, then it could give off, the texture could give off a sense of, or the artwork could give off a sense of like this is something that's distant or cold or foreboding, right? You could have a architecture. There was this big, massive building that was all kind of smooth metal and gives off this sense of, like I said, the sterile or cold or smooth. And so you're going to look at that and see it as foreboding or institutionalized, like you might think of hospital. We tend to, so let's put that under subversive because this is where it plays a part in it, right? Is that question: how does texture influence how we perceive art? Right, well, that idea of that we have associations with textures based on experiences, just like with mass and volume. Okay, and so then this can create feelings associated with those textures. For example, if, let's say a cactus you think of as painful, right? So you have that sensation because cacti have the prickly needles on them that can actually come off and hurt when you touch it. And so you have an aversion to touching a cactus because from experience you know that type of texture is painful. So if you have an artwork that has that used, whether implied or actual, that's going to create an immediate association in our brain with that feeling of pain. And so then how you perceive that artwork is going to be very different than if you have a pillow, which you tend to perceive as soft and comfortable. So you immediately get a sense of something being safe and comfortable and nice, right? Versus painful. And so what subversive texture does is it plays with that connection of why texture is so important in both implied texture and two-dimensional art, and why texture is important in actual texture is important in three-dimensional art. Subversive texture then contradicts our previous, we'll say, tactile experiences. Usually how it does this is that subversive texture in art is that the artist will use a texture not associated with the object. So you might have the cactus that is soft, is made up of soft material. And so when you touch it, right, you have this soft, comfortable feeling, but it's the exact opposite of what you expect a cactus to be. And this is specifically done a lot of times to essentially invite, well, it's used a lot of time for commentary. On, we'll say preconceived, preconceptions. Yeah, let's do that. Preconception on objects or materials. Often the objects though, right? So this can be basically a critical analysis of how the viewer normally sees things. It can also be done, and it gives you a sense of the object or the artwork or object being wrong, because we naturally expect it to be one way. And so what this does is it makes you stop and think, right? If you just see artwork that is exactly as what a cactus that's supposed to be a cactus, and the materials used are, the textures used are what a cactus is, then you don't stop and contemplate that as much. But if you then have something where it looks like a cactus and you go to touch it, or you're encouraged to touch it and you find out it's soft, it makes it, no matter what, even if you want to just move on, it makes you stop and think. So let's look at some examples with that. Here's one of actual texture, right? This is made out of driftwood. And you have different writing today apparently. Driftwood, right? And you have different sculptures. This artist makes different sculptures out of driftwood, and it's wood. And driftwood also specifically is lighter but it has the texture of wood. This is that, you don't usually say actual texture, but it's actual texture. It is what it is. Actual texture is that it is what is expected. That's not the surprise, right? The idea is more just that the idea of transforming wood into a different object. But the artist is not playing around with the texture being different than what you expect. Here's an example of actual and implied texture. The actual texture, right, if you're thinking of porcelain or marble, right, the stone, and it appears to be smooth and hard, right? That is the texture, and that's what we kind of expect. Maybe even heavy too. And yet you have this veil, right, that is usually, a veil is cloth and light and airy. And the way that they did this stone, right, with the veil, it almost doesn't look like stone. So when you can have sculptures made out of stone where they've carved it in a way that it doesn't even appear that it's stone, this looks like, fabric. And so that is the implied, I'll put it to here, texture. And the actual texture is, all of it, right? Every aspect is the actual, but within the actual, you have this implied. So you can have both actual volume and implied mass. You can also have actual texture and implied texture together, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other all the time. Here we have a photo, right? And this is a photo of, it kind of cut it off so you can't tell that it's not, well, it's a photo, you're looking at a photo, right? We're not touching actual rope. It's not a form. This is rope, and it was a picture that was taken, but the picture is not the texture of rope. It's not three-dimensional. It's not a form. Therefore, this is implied texture of a rope. But we get a sense of that, right? Implied texture is important because it's implied that it's the rope. You automatically have expectations in your head of rope being kind of rough, twisted, knotted, coarse, maybe little pieces of the rope coming off, right? And that's from experience, and that's going to then give a sense of how I view this art versus if I had no experience with the texture of rope and it wasn't an actual form or three-dimensional object that I could actually touch to feel it, then the implied texture may not be as effective, right? So implied texture also has an expectation that you've experienced that texture before. Here's the drawings of a cat and a dog, right? And you have the implied texture is the fur. Or even the nose, right? That you have a sense of that, but especially the fur. This is what I was highlighting with this one, is it gives us a sense of the implied texture of fur. Again, this is this idea of fabric and this idea of soft and the folds, right? It's drawing, but it gives a sense of the implied of what the texture would be. And then you have subversive texture. So here we have a spoon and a plate and a cup or bowl made out of fur. Well, that's subversive because this is not the expected texture, right? You're thinking with plates and stuff, the material, clay is usually fired clay or porcelain or some other kind of component of that, right? Which is not this. This also is a good example of subversive texture because you wouldn't want to eat off of this, right? You think about what we eat with the spoons with metal, right? For spoons. And you use this type of stuff for eating, and yet you look at a texture here that is not for eating. This would not be conducive from eating out of, and that was intentional to make you stop and think of it. And you should get this sense of it looks weird. Subversive texture tends to make you go, wait, what? That seems off. because it is. It's not what our brain is expecting it to be. That's key with a subversive, is that expectation. Okay, and then this is a good one too, right? So here you have a shoe, and yet it's with thumbtacks all over it. Now, this is also commentary on what? Think about this type of shoe, high heels. Well, what is always this saying, at least, for most people, you guys be able to, even if you've never worn high heels, right? What's the feeling of high heels? Well, it could be fashion, but it also could be that it's uncomfortable, right? There's always the saying, oh, it's hurting my feet. It's uncomfortable because you are squeezing your feet into here, your toes, and then it's at an angle, right? So high heels have that sense of that. And then this, of course, is painful, just painful to look at because we have an expectation of what that texture is going to be. And so then you get this commentary on the painful nature of high heels in art. But if you just had a regular high heel being portrayed in art, you might not think about that, even though that is an association we make. But the instant you use a subversive texture that's obviously not a texture that's used for high heels, that gets portrayed. So subversive texture is really good for political commentary on social aspects of society. It's used a lot in advertisements as well because of the nature of what it does. And then this one is implied in subversive texture. So this is a photo, right? But you also have, so that's the implied. And then the subversive texture is, of course, that it's a person, but the texture is not skin, right? It looks like a tree bark. And so, again, the duality of this. And I think that's important to know. With these fundamentals, a lot of this stuff overlaps, and it's not one or the other. And then you get a whole unique experience. Instead of just looking at a person in a photo, you're looking at this various texture here, even on here, and having a sense of it being rough and like flaky. That is flaking off. That's what it kind of looks like. So right, it's just this kind of either the opposite of skin or healthy skin, right? So that's one thing where it looks weird or feels a little weird. The other thing, of course, is you've got nature, versus humanity or biology. So all of these things, subversive really makes you stop and think. Implied, though, can be just as powerful as actual texture. Those are kind of the key things I want to get out of it, is that implied can be just as powerful as actual texture. Subversive texture is really good at making you stop and think, and what's the commentary behind this. It usually should have a feeling, a sense of that's off, but that you can also do that with implied mass as well, and playing around with our expectations. Volume, mass, and texture all have components of expectations of what an object's supposed to be. And then when artists take that and play around with that, it can drastically change the meaning and our interactions within art. Okay, so that's where we're stopping today. We're going to look at scale and value and perspective in the next lecture.